The station orbited Verath Prime, like a crown above a dead world. It was called the Grand Chamber of the Interstellar Accord, and it was the most powerful room in the known galaxy. 11 civilizations sat inside it. 11 flags hung from the high ceiling. 11 species had sent their best people to this place to decide how the galaxy would be run. Humanity had been invited for the first time. Ambassador Lena Vasquez stood at the entrance of the main hall and looked at the long table inside. It was carved from the bone-white stone of Verath Prime itself. It had taken the Vithani 3 years to build it. It was beautiful. It was also clearly not built with humans in mind. The seats were shaped for bodies that were not human. The table was too high. The air smelled like chemicals that made her eyes water. She did not complain. She straightened her jacket, picked up her folder, and walked inside. They watched her as she came in. Some of them had never seen a human in person before. A few leaned toward each other and spoke in low voices. Vasquez did not look at them. She walked to her seat, sat down, and opened her folder. High Arbiter Sorathvel sat at the head of the table. He was Vethani, tall, gray-skinned, with long fingers and large black eyes that never seemed to blink. His species communicated partly through the sounds they made with their mouths, and partly through low harmonic vibrations that humans could not hear. He had been the lead diplomat of the Council for 60 years. He had handled first contact talks with 4 different civilizations. He had never failed to reach an agreement. He looked at Vasquez for a moment. Then he looked away toward the rest of the table and began to speak. His voice was calm and slow, like someone reading a list of facts they had already decided were true. He told the chamber that the Council had spent many months preparing for this summit. He told them that humanity's arrival in faster-than-light travel 40 years ago had been noted with great interest. He said that humanity showed promise. He used the word promising 3 times in the first 5 minutes. Each time he said it, it sounded more like the word a teacher uses for a student who is still too young to be taken seriously. Then he nodded to his aide, who placed a thick document in front of every delegate at the table, including Vasquez. Sorathvel explained what the document contained. Humanity would give up control of the outer colonies in the Kepler Belt. The Council would call this a managed sovereignty zone, which meant the colonies would still technically belong to humans, but the Council would decide what happened there. Humanity would also reduce its naval forces by 40% and hand those ships over to the collective fleet. Any future terraforming projects, any plans to make new worlds livable, would first need Council approval before work could begin. He said all of this the way someone says something they expect no one to argue with. In exchange, humanity would receive protection. The Drachneth hegemony was moving along the edges of the spiral arm. They were large, aggressive, and had been crushing smaller civilizations for decades. Without the Council standing between them and Earth, Sorathvel explained, humanity would likely not survive the next 10 years. He said this gently, like a doctor delivering bad news. Vasquez listened. She did not move. She did not frown. She turned the pages of the document one by one, and read everything. When a word was unclear, she wrote a small note in the margin. When a clause seemed strange to her, she read it twice. The other delegates watched her out of the corners of their eyes. A few expected her to look upset. She did not look upset. She looked like a person doing a job. After Sorathvel finished speaking, he asked if there were any questions. Vasquez looked up from the document. She asked her first question. It was about the legal definition of managed sovereignty, and whether that definition had ever been changed by the Council without the agreement of the species involved. Sorathvel answered smoothly. She asked a second question about what happened to the ships humanity was supposed to hand over if humanity later withdrew from the accord. Sorathvel's answer was slightly less smooth. She asked a third question about the exact language used to define a terraforming project versus routine planetary maintenance, because the document did not make that clear. By the fifth question, the chamber was quiet in a different way than it had been before. A few delegates had stopped looking at their own papers and were watching Vasquez instead. Prix of the Murath, a small insectoid being near the far end of the table, had opened a second notepad and was writing quickly. Sorath Vel answered each question. He was polite. He was patient. He smiled once, which for a Vethani was a significant effort. Then Vasquez closed her folder. She placed both hands flat on the table. She looked at Sorath Vel directly, and she thanked him. She said the presentation had been very thorough. She said she could see that a great deal of work had gone into the document. She said she was sure the council believed the terms were fair. Then she said that humanity would not be signing. She said it simply and clearly, the way someone says something they have already finished thinking about. The chamber did not go loud. It went very still. Several delegates stopped moving entirely. Sorath Vel's large black eyes stayed on her face, and for just a moment, something behind them shifted. Not anger, more like a person who steps onto a stair in the dark and finds it is not where they expected. He recovered quickly. He reminded her still calmly that the Drachneth were not a threat to be taken lightly. That without protection, without the weight of the Accord standing behind humanity, the outcome would be ugly. He said these things in a measured tone that was meant to sound like concern. Vasquez picked up her folder and stood up. She said she understood his position. She said she wished the council well. She thanked the room again, looked once around the table at the 11 flags hanging above the 11 delegates, and then she walked toward the door. Her team followed her without a word. The door closed behind them. For a long moment, no one at the table spoke. Then 2 delegates began talking at once, and the chamber broke into noise. Sorath Vel did not join the noise. He turned in his chair and looked out through the wide viewport behind him. The human shuttle was already pulling away from the docking ring, its small running lights moving steadily toward the dark. He watched it go. "They'll be back," he told his aide, who was standing just behind his left shoulder. "Fear always brings them back." His aide watched the shuttle too. It was getting smaller now, moving away with no hesitation, no circling, no signal on any channel. "Yes, High Arbiter," his aide said. 6 months passed. The council waited. That was what they expected to do. Wait a short while, let the fear settle into human bones, and then receive a quiet message asking to reopen talks. It had happened before. It had happened with the Marath, with the Sarathi, even with the proud and stubborn Velkon, who had stormed out of the summit once and come back 11 days later, with their heads low and their terms already softened. Species always came back. The galaxy was a cold and dangerous place, and no one survived it alone. But humanity did not send a message. Not in the first month, not in the second, not at all. At first, the council treated the silence as stubbornness. Sorath Vel told his staff to be patient. He said the humans were proud and needed time to accept the reality of their situation. He said this with the steady confidence of a man who had seen this exact situation many times before. His staff nodded and went back to their work. By the 3rd month, the silence began to feel different. It was Prix who noticed it first. Prix of the Murath was not a diplomat. He was an intelligence analyst, one of the best the council had. His species had compound eyes that could track dozens of small movements at once, and his mind worked in a similar way. He tracked patterns. He tracked numbers. He tracked the small details that most people ignored. And he had built a career on finding the thing that did not fit. He had been monitoring human communications since before the summit, as he monitored all provisional member species. After the walkout, He expected the traffic to change in a predictable way. More distress signals, more urgent internal communications, more noise that came with panic. He had seen it before with other species. Fear made civilizations loud. Humanity went quiet. Not silent. The communications were still there. But they had changed. The open channels had emptied out. The regular trade signals, the colony check-ins, the civilian broadcasts that human ships had been sending openly for years, all of it had pulled back and gone somewhere else. The signals were still happening. Pricks could see the faint edges of them. But they were encrypted now, deeply and carefully encrypted, in a way that his best tools could not break. That was the first thing that bothered him. The second thing was the construction. Deep-range sensors along the Council's border with human space had started picking up energy signatures from inside the Kepler belt. At first, the readings seemed like normal industrial activity, mining, manufacturing, the usual background noise of a working colony system. But Pricks ran the numbers, and the numbers did not make sense. The energy output was too high. The heat signatures were wrong for standard human ship production. Something was being built, and it was being built fast, and it was being built in large numbers. He filed a report. Then he filed another one. Then he requested a meeting with the full Intelligence Committee and stood in front of 12 senior council officials and told them, in plain language, that something was happening inside human space that he did not yet understand, and that he believed the council should pay very close attention. The committee thanked him and told him to keep watching. He kept watching. Meanwhile, on the other side of the border, the Drachneth were moving. The Drachneth hegemony had been informed, quietly through back channels, that humanity had rejected the council's protection. This was useful information for the hegemony. They had been watching human space for years, curious about the new species that had appeared so suddenly and spread so quickly across the outer arm. Without the Council's protection, humanity was, in theory, an easy target. A young civilization with a small fleet and no powerful allies. The Drachneth sent a fleet to the colony world of New Carthage. It was not an invasion. Not yet. It was what the Drachneth called a presence operation. They would park their ships near the colony, make sure their weapons were visible, open a channel, and inform the humans that the hegemony now considered this region of space to be under their sphere of influence. Most species at this point would begin negotiating. The Drachneth had done this many times. It worked because it was simple. It worked because it was frightening. A fleet of warships outside your homeworld had a way of making even the most stubborn leaders suddenly very interested in finding a compromise. The Drachneth fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel in the space above New Carthage, and immediately understood that something was wrong. The colony was there, just as expected. The cities were lit. The ships in the docking lanes were moving normally. Everything looked as it should. But between the Drachneth fleet and the planet, there was something that had not been in any of their intelligence reports. A defensive grid, a full network of weapons platforms, satellites and automated drone units spread across the approach vectors, in a pattern that was dense, layered, and very clearly not improvised. It had been planned. It had been built carefully and deliberately. And it had been built recently, because their intelligence from 4 months ago had shown nothing like it. The Drachneth fleet commander, a veteran named Gorith Sek, who had run 11 of these operations without a single complication, stared at his sensor displays for a long time. He counted the platforms, he counted the drones, he ran the numbers in his head, and did not like the answer he got. Then a human voice came over the open channel. It was calm and unhurried, like someone who had been expecting this call. "You are in our space," the voice said. "You have 4 hours to leave it. No panic, no pleading, no offer to talk. Just a clear statement of fact and a time limit." Gorith Sek called for reinforcements and settled in to wait. He told himself they were just being dramatic. He told himself no colony defense grid, however well built, could hold against a full hegemony strike force. He told himself the humans would come to their senses before the 4 hours were up. He watched the clock and waited for the humans to start asking to negotiate. They did not ask. Back at the Grand Chamber, Prix delivered his latest report to the Council with steady hands and an expression that most people could not read. He laid his findings on the table: the encrypted communications, the construction signatures, the new Carthage grid, the intercepted sensor data from the Drachneth approach. He organized it all clearly, point by point. Then he added his conclusion at the end, the one that had kept him awake for 3 nights. The humans had not panicked after the walkout. They had not scrambled. Instead, they had gone quiet and gone to work, and what they had built in 6 months was something that should have taken years. He looked at the council members around the table and said what he believed to be true. They were not afraid of the Drachneth before the walkout, he said. I believe they were never afraid of the Drachneth at all. He paused. I am beginning to ask myself what they know that we do not. The room was quiet after that. Not the polite quiet of people waiting for the next speaker. The heavier kind. The kind that settles in when a room full of intelligent people all arrive at the same uncomfortable thought at the same time, and no one wants to be the first to say it out loud. The Drachneth reinforcements arrived 8 months after the walkout. Gorath Sek had waited for 4 hours, then 8, then 2 full days, and the humans had not opened a negotiation channel. They had not lowered their weapons grid. They had not done anything except hold their position and wait with the same quiet patience that was beginning to seriously unsettle him. When his reinforcements finally dropped out of faster-than-light travel behind him and filled his rear sensors with the familiar shapes of hegemony warships, he felt better. Numbers had a way of making problems smaller. He now had enough firepower to crack the colony grid open and make the point that needed to be made. He sent one final message to New Carthage before giving the order to advance. He told them they had one last chance to stand down. The human voice came back almost immediately. It was the same voice as before. Same calm tone. Not afraid. We heard you the first time, it said. Our answer is the same. Gorath Sek gave the order. The council watched everything through long-range sensor relays. Prix sat in the monitoring room with 4 of his analysts and watched the battle data come in, piece by piece, in real time. Several senior council members had gathered behind him. Nobody had asked them to come. They had simply shown up, one by one, drawn by the same quiet anxiety that had been building in the Grand Chamber for weeks. They stood in a row and watched the screens and said very little. The battle began the way most battles began, with the larger force pushing forward and the smaller force holding its line. The Drachneth advanced in a wide formation, their ships heavy and powerful, their weapon systems among the best in the known galaxy. On paper, the human fleet defending New Carthage should have lasted a few hours at most. The Drachneth outnumbered them. Their ships were bigger. Their weapons hit harder. Every model, every calculation, every historical comparison pointed to the same result. The models were wrong. The first thing that surprised Gorath Sek was the noise. Not sound. There was no sound in space. But the electronic noise. The moment his fleet crossed into engagement range, his targeting systems began to behave strangely. Readings flickered. Lock-on signals dropped and reappeared in the wrong places. Ships that his sensors showed ahead of him were not where his weapons expected them to be. His gunners were firing in ghosts. His officers were shouting at each other across the bridge, trying to figure out what was happening to their systems. It took them too long to understand that the humans were doing it deliberately, flooding their electronics with interference so precise and so well-timed that it felt like fighting in the dark. The second thing that surprised him was the human ships themselves. They did not fight the way any species he had ever encountered fought. Most fleets, when pressed by a stronger force, either retreated or formed a defensive wall and tried to absorb the damage until something changed. The humans did neither. Their ships moved in ways that looked almost reckless, breaking formation, cutting across each other's paths, splitting into small groups that darted in and out of the Drachneth advance from unexpected angles. 3 times, Gorath-Sek thought he had a human ship cornered, and 3 times the ship did something that his tactical officers insisted should not have worked, and somehow worked anyway. One human destroyer took a direct hit from a Drachneth heavy cannon, a shot that should have split it in half. It did not split in half. It listed hard, venting gas from a torn hull section, and then its engines fired again, and it came back into the fight. Gorath-Sek watched the sensor data, and genuinely did not understand it. His damage reports said the ship should not be moving. It was moving. He later learned that human damage control crews worked during battle, that they sent people into damaged sections while the fight was still happening, sealing breaches and rerouting power with their hands, while weapons fire shook the hull around them. He had never heard of any species doing this. It also explained things he could not otherwise explain. Then, 2 hours into the battle, the new ships appeared. They came from behind New Carthage, rising out of the planet's shadow in a line. They were large, not as large as the biggest Drachneth warships, but large enough, and they were shaped differently from anything in the Council's registry. They were dark and angular and stripped of anything that was not functional. No curves, no decoration, nothing that did not serve a purpose. They moved with a heaviness that matched their size, but their weapon systems were already active and targeting before they had even fully cleared the planet's edge. Prix stared at the screen. He opened his notepad and wrote 2 words at the top of a blank page: Hammer Class. He did not know what humanity called these ships. He named them himself because it was the only word that fit. What came next was not elegant. It was not the careful, clever maneuvering of the smaller human ships that had confused the Drachneth for the past 2 hours. It was simple and direct and very heavy. The Hammer-class ships pushed into the Drachneth flank and hit it the way their name suggested. The Drachneth ships that had been advancing with confidence 20 minutes earlier now found themselves caught between the original defense grid, the fast-moving human destroyers on their other side, and the new ships pressing in from below. Gorath-Sek tried to reorganize his fleet. He gave the right orders. His officers carried them out as well as they could. It was not enough. The Drachneth formation broke. First 1 ship pulled back, then 3 more. Then the retreat became general, a tide going out. Ships that had never turned away from a fight in 300 years of hegemony history were now burning their engines hard, trying to get back to safe space. 60% casualties. The rest in full retreat. The battle was over in 4 hours. When the last Drachneth ship cleared the engagement zone, the human fleet did not chase them. They held their position around New Carthage, steady and calm, the same way they had been before the shooting started. The defense grid was still active. The Hammer-class ships moved back into a holding pattern above the planet. Then a new signal opened, not aimed at the Drachneth, but at a frequency the Council used for official communications. A frequency the humans should not have known about. They knew it anyway. Admiral Yusuf Okafor's voice came through clearly, without static, without hesitation. "The Kepler belt is ours," he said. "The space around it is ours. Anyone who disagrees is welcome to come and explain their objection in person." In the monitoring room, nobody moved for several seconds. Then Sorath Vel, who had come in quietly near the end of the battle and was standing at the back of the room, turned and walked toward the door. "Convene an emergency session," he said to his aide without stopping. His voice was calm, but it had lost something. The certainty that usually lived in it was gone, quietly and completely, like a light someone had switched off. "Do not discuss this on open channels. He did not look back at the screens. He did not need to. The emergency session was called the morning after the battle. Every senior council member was present. They sat around the great white table in the grand chamber, and for the first time in a very long time, the room felt smaller than it used to. The flags of 11 civilizations still hung from the ceiling. The stone table was still beautiful, but something had shifted in the air of the place, quietly and permanently, the way a room feels different after a window breaks in it, even after the glass has been swept away. Sorath Vel opened the session without his usual measured calm. He got straight to the point. He told the room that the council had made a serious error in its evaluation of humanity, and that before any decisions were made about how to proceed, they needed to understand exactly what kind of species they were dealing with. He turned to the far end of the table and nodded. Avalon of the Sarathis stood up. She was old, even by Sarathi standards, and her species lived for a very long time. She was thin and pale, with silver markings along her arms that darkened with age. And she had spent most of her 300 years working inside the Council's historical archives, the vast, climate-controlled vaults deep in the station where the records of every known civilization were stored. She had studied the rise and fall of more cultures than most species knew existed. She had watched, through documents and data, as civilizations burned bright and then went out. She was not easily shaken. She had been given the task of compiling a full historical profile of humanity 3 days ago. Sorath Vel had expected the work to take several weeks. She had come back in 3 days. She looked shaken. She began without introduction, because she had decided on the walk to the chamber that there was no good way to introduce what she was about to say. It was better to simply say it. She told them about the wars first. Human history, she explained, was soaked in conflict the way few other civilizations' histories were. They had fought each other for thousands of years, over land, over belief, over resources, over ideas, over things that even she, with all her experience, found difficult to fully explain. They had developed weapons slowly, and then quickly, and then terrifyingly fast. They had invented ways to burn cities, ways to poison the air, ways to kill thousands of people at once from a great distance. Every time one side found a way to fight better, the other side found a way to fight better still. It never stopped. It just changed shape. The council members shifted in their seats. This was not entirely surprising. Many young civilizations had violent histories. Sorath Vel had heard this kind of summary before. Then Avalon told them the part that was different. Humanity had survived all of it. Not just survived, they had been beaten down to almost nothing, multiple times across their history, and every single time they had rebuilt. There had been plagues that killed nearly half their total population in some regions. They had rebuilt. There had been wars so large and so destructive that entire countries were left as rubble and ash. They had rebuilt. There had been famines, floods, collapses of entire civilizations within their own world's history, periods of darkness that lasted generations. They had always rebuilt. Every time, without exception. And they had never needed anyone else to do it. The room was quieter now. Sorath Vel's fingers were still on the table. He was listening in a different way than he had been a few minutes ago. Avalon moved to the part that she said had kept her awake for 2 nights straight. At a certain point in their history, she explained, humanity had developed weapons capable of ending all life on their planet. Not weapons that could destroy a city, not weapons that could win a war, weapons that could end everything. Every human being, every animal, every living thing on the surface of Earth. The technology existed. They had built it. Multiple groups of them had built it, in fact, pointed it at each other, and held it ready for decades. She paused there, and let that sit for a moment. Then she told them that humanity had chosen not to use it. Not because they couldn't. Not because the weapons stopped working. Not because someone more powerful stepped in and took the weapons away. They chose, on their own, through argument and negotiation and sheer difficult effort, to pull back from that edge. They made agreements. They reduced the weapon stockpile slowly over generations. They did not fully solve the problem, and they were the first to admit that, but they chose to try, and they kept choosing it, year after year. Avalon said she had spent her entire career studying civilizations, and she had never found another species that had stood at that particular edge and stepped back from it by choice. The chamber was completely silent. She continued. She told them about a human concept she had found repeated throughout their history, in many different forms and many different languages, across cultures that had never spoken to each other. She had spent a long time trying to find the right translation. The closest she could get in the common tongue was something like this: the ability to suffer a terrible loss, decide that the loss was not enough to stop them, and then move forward with more determination than before. Not in spite of the suffering, sometimes, she said, almost because of it. She had no equivalent word for it in her own language. No council species did. She had checked. Then she told them about the numbers Prix had compiled, the construction rates, the new ship classes, the speed of the Kepler belt buildup. She laid it out simply. If humanity continued at its current rate, in 18 months, it would have a fleet that could match the Council's combined strength. Not exceed it, necessarily. Match it. She stopped speaking and sat down. The silence lasted a long time. Then Elder Tavash of the Murath, who was the oldest member of the Council, and who had said almost nothing during the entire session, leaned forward and spoke. He asked the question in a slow and careful voice, the way someone asks something they have been turning over in their mind for a while, and have finally decided must be said out loud. He asked whether the Council had originally invited humanity to the table as a courtesy, because it was the polite thing to do for a young civilization, or whether, somewhere underneath the courtesy, they had invited them because they were already, quietly, afraid. And if they had been afraid, he said, whether the treaty they had written, the one that asked humanity to hand over ships and colonies and authority, had been less about protecting humanity and more about making sure humanity stayed manageable. Nobody answered him. The silence that followed was not the silence of people who had no answer. It was the silence of people who had one and did not want to say it. Avalon looked at her notes. She had one more thing to add. She had saved it for last because she did not know how to place it anywhere else. She read it without looking up. Every species the Council had ever brought under its protection, she said, had needed that protection to survive. She had checked the records going back 200 years. Every one of them. She had found no period, not one, in all of human history where humanity had genuinely needed someone else to ensure their survival. She closed her notes. They were always going to be fine, she said quietly. The only question was always whether everyone else would be. The message from the Council arrived on a Tuesday morning, Earth time. It was formal and carefully worded, the way all official Council communications were. It expressed a desire to resume diplomatic dialogue. It used phrases like mutual benefit and renewed understanding, and the shared interests of all spacefaring peoples. It was polite. It was thorough. It said a great deal without admitting very much. Ambassador Lena Vasquez read it once at her desk, set it down, and looked out the window for a moment. Then she picked up her pen and wrote her reply. It was 4 sentences long. She thanked the Council for reaching out. She confirmed that humanity was willing to meet. She suggested a new location, a station that humanity had built in neutral space, one that had not existed 12 months ago. She said the date and the time. Then, at the very end, she added one line that was not formal at all. She wrote, "We know. We have been waiting." She sent it before anyone could suggest she soften it. The new station was called Meridian Point. It was smaller than the Grand Chamber at Verith Prime, with lower ceilings and simpler walls and seats that were shaped to fit human bodies, because humans had built it. There were no flags hanging from the ceiling. There was nothing decorative about it at all. It was clean and functional and lit with a steady white light that made everything in the room very clear and very visible. The council delegation arrived first. Sorath Vel led them in, as he always did, and he stopped briefly when he stepped through the door and looked around the room. It was not what he had expected. He did not say so. He found his seat and sat down, and folded his long gray hands on the table, and waited. The human delegation came in 2 minutes later. Vasquez walked to her seat the same way she always did, straight back, quiet face, folder under her arm. She sat down, placed the folder on the table, and looked at Sorath Vel directly. "High Arbiter," she said. "Ambassador," he replied. There was a brief silence. Then Vasquez opened her folder and began. The terms she laid out were simple, and she went through them without rushing. Humanity wanted full sovereign equality inside the council. Not provisional membership, not managed status, not a seat at the table with conditions attached. Equal standing, equal vote, equal voice. The Kepler Belt colonies and all human-controlled space would remain entirely under human authority with no oversight from any council body. On the matter of the Drachneth, humanity was willing to share intelligence and coordinate strategy, but through a mutual defense framework, one where every party contributed and every party had an equal say in decisions. A partnership. She finished and closed her folder and waited. Sorath Vel was quiet for a moment. Then he said that the council had given her terms serious consideration before the meeting. He had expected something close to this, and that there was broad agreement on most points. He acknowledged, with a care that cost him something, that the original treaty had been written from a position of assumptions that had since proven to be incorrect. He did not elaborate on that. He moved forward. The discussion that followed was long and detailed and mostly civil. Delegations asked questions. Vasquez answered them. Her team passed documents across the table. The rooms stayed quiet and focused, the way rooms do when the people in them understand that what they are doing matters. Then one of the younger council members spoke up. His name was Devarath Sol, and he represented the Velkon, a species known for their directness, which sometimes came out as bluntness, and sometimes as something harder. He had been listening for most of the session with his arms crossed and his expression flat, and when he finally spoke, he did not ease into it. He said that humanity was unpredictable. He said that they acted alone without warning and without consultation. That the events of the past 12 months had shown they were willing to build military strength in secret and use it without asking anyone's permission. He said admitting them as full equals set a precedent that could not be undone, and that the accord had been built on structures that required a certain amount of trust, and he was not sure humanity had earned that trust or that they even wanted it. He looked at Vasquez when he said it. He was not being cruel. He meant every word. The room went still. Several delegates looked at the table. Several others looked at Vasquez. Vasquez did not answer immediately. She looked at Devarath Sol for a moment, and her expression was not offended or cold. It was closer to the look of someone who has heard a fair point and is deciding how to respond to it honestly. She said he was not wrong. She said humanity did act alone sometimes, and probably would again, because that was a true thing about them, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. She said, the accord structures were built on assumptions that did not always account for species that moved as fast as humanity had moved, and that was a real problem that would need real solutions over time. Then she reached into her folder and slid a single document across the table toward the center. She did not explain it. She just placed it there. Sorath Vel leaned forward and picked it up. He read the first page. Then he read it again. His large black eyes moved slowly across the text, and did not move on until he was finished with every line. Then he passed it to the delegate on his left, without a word. It moved around the table. Each person who read it changed slightly, a stillness coming into the face, a shift in posture. By the time it reached Devarath Sol, the room had already changed temperature in a way that had nothing to do with the air system. The document was an intelligence report. Humanity had compiled it over 6 months from their own sensor networks, their own deep space listening posts, their own sources inside Drachneth space. It detailed a second Drachneth mobilization, much larger than the fleet that had come to New Carthage. This one was not aimed at human space. It was aimed at the Council's core worlds. The timing, the fleet positions, the supply lines, it was all there, laid out in careful detail, and it had been known to humanity for 6 months. They had said nothing. They had waited. They had waited to see if the Council would come back to the table on their own. If the Council had not reached out, the report would have stayed in a human filing system, and no one would ever have known about it. The Council had come back, so humanity shared it. Devrath Sol set the document down. He uncrossed his arms. He did not speak for a while. The treaty was signed before the end of the day. It was not the Council's treaty, the one that had been placed in front of Vasquez 12 months ago, with its neat, pre-written terms and its quiet assumptions about who had power over whom. This one was different. It had been built by both sides, line by line, across a table where no one sat higher than anyone else. When the session ended and the delegations began to file out, Sorath Vel paused near the door. Vasquez was a few steps ahead of him. He spoke without thinking about it too carefully, which was rare for him. He said that his civilization had evaluated humanity the same way they evaluated every new species that came to the table, and that this had been a mistake, and that he wanted her to know he understood that now. Vasquez stopped walking. She turned and looked at him. Her expression was steady, and there was nothing sharp in it, nothing that wanted to make the moment bigger than it was. You did. She held his gaze for just a moment. Then she turned and walked out into the corridor, her footsteps steady and unhurried, the same as they had always been. Sorath Vel stood in the doorway and watched her go. He thought about all the species the Council had ever welcomed, the ones who had needed guidance, the ones who had needed protection, the ones who had come to the table already grateful, already looking for someone stronger to stand behind. Then he thought about humanity, who had walked out of a room full of the most powerful civilizations in the galaxy without looking back, gone home, built something the galaxy had never seen before, won a battle that should not have been winnable, and then sat back down at a new table they had built themselves, and waited for everyone else to catch up. He was glad, in a way that went deeper than politics or strategy, that they were on the same side now. And somewhere underneath that gladness, quiet and honest and not entirely comfortable, was the clear and simple knowledge that he never wanted to find out what the other version of this story looked like.